Welcome to Hiraeth, the home of modern Welsh politics. Hello everybody, welcome to a live recording of the Hiraeth podcast, held proudly in partnership with the Wales Governance Centre. We'll also express our thanks to Mark Drakeford MS for sponsoring tonight's event in the Senedd Newydd. The topic of this evening's recording is, of course, Aneurin Bevan, one of the most quoted, misquoted, revered and misunderstood politicians in the history of Wales and Britain. But now we get to read his own words, thanks to Dr. Davies, who has collated the writings of Bevan from Tribune in his fantastic new book, This Is My Truth. And to speak about this book, of course, I'd like to welcome Dr. Davies. The Member of Parliament for Cynon Valley, Beth Winter MP. And the General Secretary of the Wales TUC, Shavanah Taj. So, with all book podcasts, I'd like to start off with asking the author directly, what inspired you to write this book? What about Bevan, apart from the name, of course, attracted your interest as well as sort of the interest of innumerable political figures over the years?
Yeah, so I started off being interested in the study of ideas in politics, and I was very interested in Labour politics and socialist politics in Wales and Britain as well. And when I was trying to think of a PhD topic, Aneurin Bevan just seemed natural because he just seemed to be so vital to the way, particularly Welsh Labour politicians, articulated their political philosophies and their ideologies. So I thought it was really important to try and get to the heart of Bevan's ideas, because there's lots of great material on Bevan, great biographies about Bevan, but his legacy today seems to be claimed by all sides of the political debate. So I wanted to get to the heart of Bevan's values, his principles, and so I started writing a PhD on Bevan's political thought, out as a book next year. And one of the things that really struck me when I first started doing the PhD was how there wasn't really much of Bevan's writings available, at least not easily available. There was his book In Place of Fear, a couple of other pamphlets as well, but his writings in Tribune seemed to be buried away in the archive. So the idea for this book came to, put them out to give them the light, essentially. Because again, I think Bevan is such a contestable figure that this was an opportunity for people to study Bevan in his own words, essentially.
Many people will know Bevan as this sort of remarkable orator, sort of famed for his barbs and quips, but when did that become apparent about Bevan? When did everyone know this fantastic orator and writer?
Well, I think it was quite early on, really. In terms of his oratory, he spoke at miners' conferences when he was young in Tredegar. Was a member of the local council. So his oratory skills were seen very early on. In terms of his writing skills, the earliest evidence of his writing skills was a review he wrote of the Communist Manifesto in 1921. So he was only 23, 24 at that stage. But it's a really interesting review, because it really reveals a lot of the early Bevan and where his political thought kind of derived from in his reinterpretation and critique of Marxism. And that was really the earliest evidence of Bevan's writing. And I think that his writing gets overlooked somewhat because he was such a... My mic's gone off. There we go. He was such a fantastic orator. There are some authors, so one biography by somebody called John Campbell, sometimes he can be a bit dismissive of Bevan's writing, but I think the articles here demonstrate he was quite a good journalist. There were quite journalistic writings here, but there was always that underlying political philosophy that was guiding him in his writing. So they make for very, very interesting reading, because it's not just Bevan just putting his thoughts out there on the page. He was analysing what was going on in the world, analysing what was going on in Britain, but that was underpinned by his political philosophy then. So I think they're quite revealing in that sense.
Shav, do you have an early and formative memory of Bevan?
Well, obviously I never met him in real life. Lots of us would have walked past the the infamous statue that we have so many protests right next to, which is right next to the McDonald's. And I often think, I wonder what he would have thought about, given his views on marketisation in particular, and, as a socialist. But I think for me, Bevan has, I think he's really exciting. I think he was a radical visionary. The fact that he was fearless, he wasn't scared. When you look back at some of the images, especially when he's there with Barbara Castle and they, about to walk into some of these big meetings, and he's just like, yep, we're here, this is my position, and I don't really care. And he, we talk about that clear red water, particularly when it comes to UK and Welsh Labour politics, and politics more broadly even. And, he was very clear. He had those clear red lines, and he stuck to his guns. And he had, he wasn't scared about talking about working class interests. He understood that the socio-economic factors are intertwined and that they matter. And I think, for example, I think he would have supported, rental control, for example. And people often talk about, for example, all the debates, around independence and all of this, and one of the commissioners, so we've been talking about this all morning. But, and I wonder what he would have made of that now. And I think he's quite a complex character, but I think that what people have done is they've picked and chosen, and that's what happens with history, right? People try and rewrite history, and so I'm glad that we've got this book now, and it's, in an accessible fashion, and it's in his words. But ultimately, he was a socialist democrat, and I can totally I can relate to that.
Beth, what about you? What was your sort of first memory of hearing something of?
Well, I've always known the name Bevan, because he is one of the giants that we did get taught about in primary school. So he's always been in my sphere of knowledge, which I think is testament to the amazing work that he did do. My first and eldest son is called Aneurin as well. As it happens, so we've got a family tradition. I mean, I've got to begin, by complimenting you now on this fantastic book. I mean, I read it really quickly, but it is really it's deja vu, because what's going on currently politically, and in particular within the Labour Party, was going on during Bevan's lifetime. He was a visionary, he was a fantastic orator, but he was also a very accomplished writer, and I wasn't really aware until I read this. So like I said, I have to compliment you. I'm a very proud socialist. From reading his work and looking at what he did, the establishment of the NHS, he was a socialist. He was also a pluralist, which is a principle and an approach which I share. We need to work collaboratively. The Labour Party is, or should be, a broad church, and Bevan recognised that. He talked about class struggle, about the working class movement. He talked about the need for collective ownership of the means of production. He didn't shy away from talking about Marx. We've lost a lot in terms of the freedom and the focus on philosophy and theory, which again is contained within this book as well, the need to analyse society. And crucially, it's not just and cannot be about piecemeal change. And there is an excellent quote in there, which I may refer to later, where he talks about the establishment of the NHS, social security reform, all positive stuff. But ultimately, you've got to have that vision for a transformational societal change. And for me, it's about achieving a socialist society. So for me, and particularly given my own recent events politically, and I think the party, I've taken inspiration from this. I also find it slightly depressing that there's a cyclical problem here with politics, because and for me, fundamentally, the climate crisis. We haven't got time to waste in terms of cycles and change. There's an urgency of what needs to happen. And we have got the power. We've got the political will, if we choose to use it, to achieve the transformational change that Bevan and others currently are talking about. And hopefully we can come on to that sort of action that's needed now.
It's been alluded to already now, but in the modern day, Bevan is a figure who is admired across the factional divide in the Labour Party, but that certainly wasn't the case during his time, was it?
No, I think he annoyed a lot of people, demonstrated by the fact he was expelled from the party and almost got expelled again years later from the party. He was, Winston Churchill called him a squalid nuisance, and I think a lot of people in the Labour Party would have agreed with that. He wasn't afraid to speak his mind, and that got him into trouble, and that brought a lot of criticism and a lot of anger from fellow MPs, fellow politicians, trade union leaders as well. But yeah, he wasn't afraid to speak his mind, so he did wind people up quite a lot. But I think it comes back to what Beth was talking about in terms of he had this vision of society, and he wanted to see it unfold. And I mean, there are criticisms to be made of some of that vision from various perspectives, but he was very much determined to stick to that path. And he could compromise, he could compromise with others, but he didn't want that to compromise on certain principles.
Mm-hmm. Shav, what do you think about Bevan gives him this wide appeal in the Labour Party? You know, he's quoted widely even by figures on the right of the Labour Party, people who certainly at the time probably wouldn't have agreed with him. What about Bevan's vision, his style, his values means that people continue to quote him to this day?
So, you were talking about, talking in relation to the TUC, for example. So he was actually very critical of the TUC at the time because the TUC were taking a bit of a nuanced position around nationalisation of industry post-war, and he was just like, why would you not support this? Are you mad? Like, why is this even a conversation? Why are we having this debate? And now you look at the likes of Mick Lynch, for example, and even the TUC nationally at a UK level, they're very clear. We want nationalisation of railways. We want nationalisation of all the following things. So I guess sometimes it takes time for visions to be understood and for people to make the connection. And I think he was very quick off the mark. And I think that, the ambitions that we have today for Wales and the future that we want, I would be, people talk about who would you like to bring back to life to have dinner with. I think he would be one of those people for me. He'd be definitely my top 5. With also in terms of policy making, he was really good on understanding how you make policy. He was very crystal clear on that. How you shape policy so that you have worker interests at the heart, front and centre of what it is that you're trying to deliver. So like I say, he wasn't scared about those things. And sometimes I think that politics today, people can become a little bit focused on what is popular. And I don't want to, push the boat too much. I want to keep appealing to the broad base. And sometimes you can lose yourself in a way. And he didn't do that. He stuck to the position. And even if it meant that it was generations following, that eventually his message landed and, people understood it, well, so be it. But nonetheless, he was, I think, really clear. And the other thing I would like to say is that, we've had, politics has become quite divisive, particularly, given what's happened with Brexit and now the continuous argument around immigration, for example. And And I think that he was really clear in terms of the real issues here. And it's about having a welfare system that works, making sure that we have, it's about employment rights. How do you exercise those rights and how do you actually enforce them? And the regulation aspect of all of this as well, so that the ordinary person can feel the benefits of having a political class. And talking about a political class, he also understood what class interests were and how do you use your position of power when you are in the driving seat to make that change happen and to make it appealable to a wider group. And that's why I think that he has so many different interested voices from all sides being able to pick up on his vision today.
You talk about today. Beth, how do you think Bevan would have dealt with the Labour Party today?
I think it would have been very difficult for him in the current climate. I believe very strongly that the party is a broad church. Historically, it has been. But I do, and I have publicly said, I think there are concerns about the factionalism and the word purge was used by my colleague and friend John MacDonald earlier this week in terms of people who have certain views within the party. The party was established as a socialist party, and Bevan spoke very powerfully about the need to transform society. And I was very pleased this year to hear Mark Drakeford quote Marx himself in his Labour Party conference speech, saying that it should be from each according to their ability, to each according to the need. I mean, he actually said that. So there is, in Wales, I think we are in a different place and there is hope. And I think the cooperation agreement, talking about plurality, is something that we must support. And there are lots of progressive policies in Wales that I think the Labour Party nationally can learn from. Free school meals universally in primary schools, the universal basic income pilot, the climate ministry in Wales is the first of its kind. The work that Julie and Lee are doing is really well ahead of its game. So there are lots of things that I think within Wales that the UK Labour Party can learn from. But I do have concerns, and I think the inability for debate, discussion in an open it is so important. The only way that we move forward as a party is by having those discussions and debates. Difference is something that should be welcomed and it should be celebrated. It shouldn't be seen as a threat. And I think that we're in such a critical juncture in terms of our society and democracy. We need those transformational policies now. So yes, I think you would find it very difficult.
Shav, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think he'd find it hard, but he was who he was, and he was very proud of it. I wonder sometimes, what would it look like if he had ended up as the leader? What would the policies look like under his leadership? And if he was the person leading it, would he have been able to deliver on all of his vision? Or would he have, now you've talked about his ability to compromise, but then given what, Beth has just shared and how difficult it is, I mean, would it have been any different for him? And is it down to, the individual? Is it down to his personal character? Is it down to his beliefs, where he came from? All of those things. But I sometimes wonder, what would he have made of social partnership, for example? because he was quite clear, unions are there for workers, and you've got to, unions can't be seen as being so close to government. And I wonder, what would he have made of our kind of latest, social partnership procurement legislation? So, yeah, look, like I say, would have loved to have had that conversation with him.
Can I just quote from him? Because from a couple of the articles, right? And this resonates with me so much at the moment, given the current situation. So he says, the polarisation of British politics is not therefore between Labour and Tory. The real struggle is for the soul of the Labour Party, and that consists in our socialist purpose. In the last analysis, the financial and economic vested interests of Britain would be perforce content with the succession of Labour governments if these could be persuaded to drop socialist policies. So we don't need to tinker in around the edges as a party. We need fundamental change. And he does go on, and again, this is something that really resonated with me in terms of what he was saying. The common factor which Labour people share and which sharply distinguishes us from the Tories is socialism. And that word itself is frowned upon in certain quarters. And it shouldn't be, we should be proud of it. The more we play it down, the less we differ from our opponents and the less reason there is for people to vote for us, to get the others out. What we need, and I think this really did hit a note with me, are fewer prescriptions and more prescriptions. More let's do this and fewer don't do that. We can easily afford differences of opinion if these are not carried to the point of mortal combat. And I think that speaks as much of the situation today as it did in Bevan's time. It is extremely dangerous. It is undemocratic. We must encourage and welcome differences of opinion. And the Labour Party, as Bevan fought for, needs and has a duty to push for that alternative socialist vision. And we're at a very difficult time at the moment. But please, if you haven't read it, it really is inspirational. Very excellent. Sorry.
So I started the episode off by talking about Bevan quotes, and Beth has quoted from there, and I'm about to do the same because I always say to you, Tyler, one of my absolute favourite Bevan quotes is, "The language of priorities is the religion of socialism." But that's been misconstrued, I think, so much over the past few decades. It's been sort of stripped of its radicalism. It's designed to mean that politicians should be more practical than it is to be radical. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that it's one of these quotes where I think the second part of the quote is always just dropped off.
Yeah.
You often see, and Welsh Labour leaders have been guilty of this in conference speeches, and Labour politicians guilty of this, of saying it's all about the language. Bevan said it was all about the language of priorities, and then they just forget about the religion of socialism part. And I think it does exactly that. What that quote has done is it allows people to say, a good example was Eluned Morgan, the health minister, used that quote in plenary, talking about giving a pay rise to nurses. The debate over pay rise to nurses, and Eluned Morgan said it's about the language of priorities. And I was thinking, well, surely one of Bevan's priorities would have been to pay nurses a higher wage. It gets used to be a quote about different priorities, whereas I think what comes out very clearly for me in particularly the second chapter on Labour and the unions is, there's another good sorry, I'm picking on certain politicians here. They're just very good examples to make the point. During the Labour leadership election between Jeremy Corbyn and Owen Smith, Owen Smith presented his politics as, I'm radical, but I'm pragmatic, and I'm practical, obviously saying that Jeremy Corbyn wasn't. And he always invoked Aneurin Bevan to do that, to say Bevan was a radical politician, but he was pragmatic. But there's an article in here where Bevan criticises those who say the party needs to be more pragmatic and needs to be more practical. And he says that a lot of this debate is about the commitment to public ownership.
Yeah.
And Bevan says if you drop that from the Labour Party, there's no difference between Labour and Conservatives. It's a battle between Tweedledum and Tweedledee. He mentions Tweedledum and Tweedledee a couple of times in the book, but that's how he expressed it. So there's a lot of quotes like that. I think that's a good example of how maybe the radical element of Bevan's politics gets stripped back somewhat. But ultimately, at the end of the day, he was a Labour politician. And as I said, he could compromise. And just as he upset the Labour leadership, he could upset the left as well, denouncing unilateral disarmament in 1957, 1956 rather, really angered the left. And he was seen as selling out to the Labour right and the Labour leadership. So while he was arguing that the party needed to be more socialist and it needed to emphasise the socialist values, he was still committed, rightly or wrongly, to the Labour Party. And I think that's one of the criticisms from the left of Bevan certainly comes in, that he had too much faith in the Labour Party. And by the end of his career, there's a passage in Michael Foot's, in the second volume of Michael Foot's biography of Bevan, which is written by the journalist Geoffrey Goodman, who followed Bevan around on the 1959 conference, where Bevan just seems exhausted. He died a year later, so it may have been the start of the illness, but he just seemed physically and mentally exhausted. And he said, we've lost our chance. The Labour Party has lost its chance. There are hardly any socialists in this party. But then, the next day, at conference, he gives this rallying cry for unity within the Labour Party. You know, we all need to pull together.
But that's because he was a trade unionist, right? And as a trade unionist, what you do, you always try and pull everyone back together and remind everybody why we're here. What is our purpose as a collective? What is our purpose? And I think that for me really is significantly important. And the other thing as well is that at that time, that was around the time where unions still had power, but as unions, union membership has dropped. Of course, we've seen spikes and changes over the last couple of years. But as collective bargaining, kind of disappeared, as an industry disappeared, and all of a sudden, the size of unions has changed. You've got more small and medium-sized unions. Not all of them are Labour Party affiliated, and so they don't have that direct access over the National Policy Forum, for example, and shaping policy that is going to have worker interest at the heart of it all the time. So even now, when Labour-affiliated unions are trying to influence the Labour Party in terms of the Labour Party manifesto and the rest of it and the priorities, it's really challenging. It's not easy. So, yeah.
I think you've been a bit harsh on him, potentially, because I am a left... class sometimes extreme left, anyway, a left-winger. I mean, he was a man of his time, and I think it's easy to look back and be critical. Not saying you were being critical, but for the left to be critical of him. But having read, the articles contained within this, as well as what I know about him already, he was a man of his time, and he was very radical at that point. And yes, he was part of the Labour Party, but he had that vision, and I think we've lost the vision to a large extent within the party. And he did see that you can't bring about political change without the need for economic change as well. He could see that link in terms of what was needed, and he talked extensively, as you said, about the need for public ownership, better wages, and he talks about a national movement that we need to develop. So I think, given the time that he was writing and was a member of Parliament, I think he was, a giant of his time, really.
I think this is one of the things I find so fascinating about Bevan is all these tensions that come out. That those, particularly from sort of Ralph Miliband, New Left, criticised Bevan for, obviously said the Labour Party couldn't be a vehicle for socialist change, but Bevan believed it could be. Because Bevan really had a lot of faith in the Labour Party to create radical change. He experienced that in Tredegar. He was able to influence things. And he gets to Parliament, and all of a sudden he's dealing with people who weren't from the same background as him, and I think he struggled with that, although he did like fine dining and having a glass of Bollinger with his enemies every now and then. But that's why I think he's such a fascinating character, is that he has this faith, he really has this drive and this vision of the Labour Party is the best vehicle in order to change things. But he comes up against so many roadblocks. He comes up with people, that broad church nature of the Labour Party means he has to make compromises, and some of them he doesn't like and he lashes out, but some of them he is willing to make. And I think that's, for me, when I started researching Bevan, that was one of the things that came out. There were times where I'd read his stuff and think, oh, this is brilliant, this is fantastic. And then at other times I'd be really frustrated with him over something. And I think that's what the legacy element, I think, distorts that somewhat. And hopefully what this book does is bring some of that out to say, to demonstrate that it's not so straightforward as some people might expect. But yeah, I think that's why he's such a fascinating character, and why he is revered on the left of the party, on the right of the party, but also criticised on the left of the party, right of the party.
But he would have accepted that, wouldn't he? Because he saw that there were tensions within the party, but he was willing to see that that was a good thing. Yeah. And I think we've lost that to a large extent, because he spoke about, in his early years, particularly about, having the Communist Party become affiliated. And, all sorts of various groups, as well as the trade union movement, part of the Labour Party. So those tensions weren't seen as a negative, whereas currently tensions and differences of opinion are not embraced in the way that they should.
And I think embraced is the right word. He embraced these discussions. I think in that article you quoted from, he talks about how there's always going to be disagreements. Yeah. There's always going to be disagreements over the struggle, but you need to actually talk through those disagreements. And as you said, in the current Labour Party, it doesn't seem to that debate doesn't seem to be happening as much as it did back in the 1950s.
It's interesting that both Nye and Beth, you've talked about sort of whether the room for compromise, the disagreements within the party. But Nye, I'm interested in your thoughts. There's many people involved in the left in the UK and Wales would know, and some of the biggest fights you have are within the left. So Bevan had lots of battles within the Labour Party. Do you mind going a little bit about, just to give background to everybody, some of those battles he had with Gateskill et al.?
Yeah, well, that battle with Gateskill is often kind of simplified to be a battle over public ownership. That essentially 45 to 51 Labour government brings a lot of things into public ownership, and then the argument is consolidation versus advance. Essentially, Bevan arguing for advance, Gateskill and the revisionists arguing for consolidation. And it was about that. It was a personal battle as well. They didn't get on. And again, it comes back to this point that Bevan was from a very different background to Hugh Gateskill, an Oxbridge-educated economist and somebody who was a coal miner from the age of 30. So there was a personal battle, there was an ideological battle. And often it does get reduced to that consolidation versus advance. But then that reduces Bevan's ideas to simply being, we need more public ownership. And that's one of the criticisms that comes from different strands of Bevan, is that he never really thought through what public ownership would look like, and it would just lead to more state bureaucracy, and he never really developed that. The articles in the book demonstrate that he did start thinking about the relationship between the economy and the state. And it goes back to this review of the Communist Manifesto in 1921, where he says the materialist conception of history runs through this manifesto like a golden thread. So for him, you change the economic base, and thus you create, you develop a new society, essentially one where power is in the hands of the workers, and that creates new values, new principles within society. So there was a vision there, and again, there were times, and I say in my next book about times where he kind of retreats back from that and goes to more prosaic concerns. But there is an ideological battle there within the party. There were some things where there's agreement between the different sides, but I think that kind of sums up the Bevan Gateskill kind of kind of argument, I think.
Another interesting discussion I found in some of these articles now is the discussion about how close the Labour Party should be to the trade union movement. Would you mind, again, summing up a little bit about what Bevan's thoughts were on that?
Yeah, it was quite a complicated relationship, really. It was when I first started researching Bevan, I was surprised by his hostility in many instances because he was from the trade union movement himself. But I think that there were times, so during World War II when Labour was in coalition, Bevan criticised the trade unions for becoming too close to government there. But essentially, he supported the electoral truce and supported the coalition, but was worried that Labour politics weren't being expressed, that essentially it's conservative policy and it's just rubber stamped by the Labour Party and by the trade unions. That's what he was worried about. So his criticism of the union during World War II in particular is that they are becoming too close to government. In the 1950s, he's very critical of what he sees as the right-wing leadership of trade unions, argues that they're not listening to their members, that it's the rank and file, the voice of the rank and file isn't being heard. And when he's almost expelled in the mid-1950s, there's an article here about him standing for treasurer and why he was standing for treasurer. And he talks about the union bloc. He said, well, they were always going to vote against me. And there were trade union officials saying Bevan should be expelled from the party before the hearing had even begun. So he had this tension there. And there's one article in particular where Bevan says in a socialist society you wouldn't need trade unions because trade unions are there to protect workers within the framework of a capitalist society with collective bargaining. And Bevan said, your trade unions serve their purpose, they're really important, but then once you have socialism, you don't need trade unions anymore.
And he's right.
Yeah. Once you get to that point, trade unions are no longer needed.
Workers' paradise, we don't need trade unions. I mean, that's the ideal. Yeah. I agree.
So he had this really strange... I think he valued the importance of the industrial wing. He said the labour movement has a political wing and has an industrial wing. Sometimes he believed the industrial wing was getting too involved in the political problems. Sometimes he thought the industrial wing was doing a better job than the political wing of the Labour Party. Sometimes when he was in government, he could be quite critical of workers going on strike, because you don't strike against the Labour government. So there is this kind of tense relationship there, which, again, draws in the criticism from different sides. But it's, again, some of it comes down to personality. Didn't get along with a lot of people, but I think it does come back to ideology as well. That Bevan, as we said, in a workers' paradise, in a socialist society, you wouldn't need trade unions because the states would be representative of the people. And obviously, some people would say he was naive in that, but that was his vision of society. So the place of the trade unions becomes a bit complicated then. And you mentioned social partnership as well.
Yeah.
What he'd think about that.
I wonder. I mean, it is complicated, though, because even for us as the Wales TUC, and when we look at the British UK TUC, our Scottish colleagues always say, refer to them as the British TUC, Shav, not as the UK TUC. And it is, we have to sometimes remind them that we have got a Labour government in Wales, and it's never as straightforward as some people might assume. And you do still have to take strike action, and you do still have to continue fighting for what is right and what is just for workers, and the worker interest always comes first and foremost. And even when we were, we've got Nastreen Mansour, one of our policy officers at the back there. If anyone wants to know anything about the social partnership legislation, choose your woman. But, when we were going through all the detail in terms of what that should look like, all the unions kept saying was, what we don't want you to think is that this is going to be meaning that all of a sudden we're signing up to like a sweetheart, like no strike agreement. That's not what this is about. And that was partly because they were so worried about being seen to be so closely aligned to government. And even now we have to remind our colleagues at a UK level that, yes, of course, it would be brilliant to have a UK Labour government and have, of course, one here. But I think that they can learn quite a bit in terms of that doesn't mean that it's going to be straightforward. It doesn't mean that you're going to get everything that you're demanding straight away. And you're going to have to find ways and means of compromising or agreeing to disagree, but always sticking on the side of the workers.
Beth, how would you describe the relationship between the parliamentary labour movement and the sort of industrial trade union labour movement in the present day?
I think it's challenging. I do think it's challenging. I mean, the fact the Labour Party nationally prohibited MPs from going on the picket line, I mean, that was, you know, I just couldn't get my head around it, quite frankly. So there are challenges. I mean, just picking up and listening to Nye and Shav, though, if you allow me. I mean, I start from the importance and the fundamental need for us to have this vision. Yes, there may be differences and challenges between the trade unions and the politicians, or industrial versus parliamentary politics. If we are socialists, and if we believe, as Marx wrote, from each according to the ability to ability, then we've got far more in common than we haven't. And I think there are risks in us becoming either afraid of challenging or too challenging at times. And I want to give an example. If we look at the cost of living crisis, last summer I plugged and plugged and plugged. I fully supported in Wales the trade unions challenging the Welsh Government for additional pay, and that was the right thing to do. I also think the trade union movement, alongside the Labour Party in Wales, should have established a broad movement to push against UK government demanding fair needs funding for Wales, because they hold the purse strings. So it's not an either-or for me. I think if you've got the vision and the principles which are founded on socialism, we can work our way through those differences and divisions, because they transcend, really, the minutiae of the differences that exist. I mean, it's not insurmountable.
I understand that, and I think that broadly the position was, of course, Wales needs more funding. But when you're in the middle of a dispute, it is about political choices, right? And it's about negotiating an outcome for workers, and the unions have then got to ask their membership. And if the membership is saying, yes, we accept that it's a funding issue, however, we also know that the sum of money is this. And so there's a political choice here. Do you find something where actually the offer can be higher than what is currently on the table? If that means that we've got to take strike action in order to get that, then that's what we have to do. And then also, in terms of that additional funding, we then need to have discussions well in advance about what we're going to do with that money when it comes through. So, for example, now there's been, the long-running discussion about pay restoration. And so the Welsh Government has committed that, when it comes to public sector pay, over a decade of not having an inflation-proof pay rise, that yes, we support pay restoration. Yes, we support a pay body review. There should be maybe possibly an even different structure. And if we get a Labour government at a UK level, then we here in Wales need to be quite clear. What does pay restoration, what are our priorities for the public sector in particular here in Wales, and how do we shape and influence what the UK Labour government, if they end up as a government, as a Labour government, where it is that they will prioritise. So I think it's in principle, and as much as unions could do at the time, it was and it always will be that Wales demands better funding. We need fair funding. But at that point, it is about it's really tricky to manage a relationship. And sometimes, like I say, you've got to take it to the extreme end, but never fall out to the point that you can't come back. And that's where I'm hoping now that, particularly with the legislation that we have established, that at least the principles are there, And they are built on socialism, and they are built on, fairness and equality. And of course, we've got the future generations legislation as well, and having Fair Work now firmly embedded there. We've got a new commissioner, and he comes from the union movement. So it's going to be interesting to see how we move some of this debate forward.
No, and I appreciate it. I suppose drawn on Bevan, because I suppose as we were discussing, you touched on earlier, in terms of looking at how people interpret priorities and being pragmatic. We've got to be radical and we've got to have that vision, and we can do both. And I think Bevan had that belief that we can transform society, and we've got to have those big ideas, as well as the difficult, challenges that are inevitably within that. Because if we are going to transform society and achieve a socialist society, we've got to be bold, we've got to be radical, we've got to be united, and we've got to work collectively. And that collective movement is needed now more than ever, as I would have said, or did say.
We sit here in the seat of Welsh parliamentary power, and although Bevan operated in a time before the advent of devolution, he was, at least at the very beginning, an opponent of the creation of even the role of the Secretary of State of Wales now. Would you mind talking about his sort of attitudes towards decentralisation to Wales?
Yeah, it's another one where there's a bit of nuance, a bit of tension there. Where I think the Bevanite wing of the party is seen to be the Devo-sceptics. So as devolution was being debated in the party, people like Leo Absey and Neil Kinnock would refer to themselves as being the Bevanite wing of the party. Therefore, they were anti-devolution. But again, I think the picture's a bit more complicated than that, because there's an article here in the book on Wales. It's a very short article. It was an editorial Bevan wrote for Tribune, where Bevan's talking about a Welsh Day. They have a Welsh Day debate in Parliament, and one of his most quoted lines on this issue comes up is that there's no difference between a Welsh sheep, a Scottish sheep, and a Westmoreland sheep. So we're all sheep. So devolution's pointless, because if you're debating an issue to do with sheep farming in Wales, the same problems exist in Scotland, the same problems exist in England. So that line has been kind of used to say, well, Bevan was against devolution. But the article here, I think the way Bevan is represented, the article he wrote here doesn't really reflect that, because he's very... he talks about Wales as a culture of its own, a language of its own, which is so different from English culture, so different from Scottish culture. And that needs to be recognised. He said we need to recognise differences across the UK. And in that Welsh Day debate, he talks about there should be a special constitutional device for Wales that allows that difference to be recognised. I think for Bevan, I think he was more ambivalent towards it than being actively hostile. There's the story of the debate within the Labour shadow cabinet between Bevan and James Griffiths. James Griffiths is arguing for the creation of a Secretary of State for Wales, and Bevan is supposed to have said to him, do you really want it? And he says, yes, I really want it. He says, fine, go on then, have it, but you better make a good job of it. So Bevan, I think that kind of reflects Bevan's attitude a bit more, is that he was quite ambivalent to it, because again, it comes from, Bevan could be a bit of a British nationalist at times. Britain has the moral leadership of the world because of the creation of the NHS. And, he spoke very much in kind of pro-British terms quite often. So there was that element. But I think as well it comes back to his faith in Parliament, whether it was an unfounded faith or not. He believed that Parliament could be the vehicle for change. It was a power in the class struggle, Bevan said, where the working class, the sectional interest, the general interest was being waged against the sectional interest. And for Bevan, I think discussions about devolution might have taken away from that because he had this faith in the British state. And obviously those, myself included, who support Welsh devolution, disagree with that. I think after founding the NHS and seeing what the British state, or what you could achieve through parliamentary politics, Bevan thought, well, yes, this is the vehicle that we can use. So yeah, I think maybe ambivalence might be the best word, rather than being pro or anti. we had a tweet earlier, didn't we? Somebody saying he was against the Welsh language, against Welsh culture. He came out with things like complaining about Welsh-speaking, Welsh-writing zealots, and he did come out with stuff like this in his more less tempered moments. But I think ambivalence more than anything kind of describes that.
I think, again, going back to my comment earlier, he was a man of his time. There wasn't devolution in the 40s and 50s. We weren't in that space at that time. We are now. And I mean, I would broaden it to a discussion about the Constitution. And on the Constitution, I mean, he said the House of Lords should be abolished. He commented that he supported proportional representation, is a quote which I wasn't aware of in here. So, you know, progressive thoughts, views that I completely share. And I read that article with interest about Wales. And as you just said, Nye, he talked about embracing the difference and about our Welsh culture. I would go back, to what I said earlier as well, though, that it's not just about the politics. You've got to look at the economy. Otherwise, you can fall into the sort of nationalist, anti-English approach. So he could see, you know, as Mark said, that you've got to fundamentally change the economy. We do now have devolution. We need more, and we need the devolution of not only power, but wealth and you know, all sorts of various aspects of power. And it is about bringing decision-making as close to the people as possible. And if he was living now, I don't, again, I'm interpreting, but I don't think he'd necessarily be opposed to that, because I think that's how we can bring change. And if you look at the examples of community wealth building in Preston and the fantastic work that Jamie Driscoll has been doing up in the northeast, and some of the stuff, not myself, but other people in the valleys are doing around things like community wealth building, which is about, you know, how do we develop and retain wealth and ensure that local people own that wealth, which is about devolution, then that clearly does resonate with the sorts of approaches and vision that Bevan had. But he was a man of his time, wasn't he? You know.
Shav, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think I agree with all the comments that have been made in terms of he was a man of his times. I think, like I said, I'd be interested to see what he would have thought of devolution today, and you know, he would have been the first up as far as you know, evidence. Can we get him in? I think it would have been fascinating stuff. But you know, and of course he was a dapper dresser, right? So you can't take that away from him. But I think that we can learn a lot from him, and now as we go through kind of like changes to our curriculum and learning more and trying to understand what is Welsh identity, I would love to see, you know, him as an individual, your book, featured in our curriculum for people to kind of really get to grips with who the man really was and what his thinking was, and to have those debates and critical analysis, you know, of what his vision really was, other than just the one statue that we have next to the McDonald's.
I mean, but what he did talk about as well, which I picked up in the book, was about young people, and that is a current concern as well, about the you know, lack of political engagement of young people. And he also criticised the parliamentary structures and the setup and the detachment of politics from reality. And having been up in London for the last 3 years, it seems like 30 sometimes, it is a bubble up there. It really is so divorced from real life. And given the low, abysmal in some regards, voter turnout, you know, in elections, we've got a huge mountain to climb in terms of getting people politically engaged. And he does touch on that in some of these articles, and he's probably talked a lot more about it as well. But I found that fascinating. Yeah, and comments about young people, because they are our future, aren't they? And we need them to engage. And with the climate crisis, you know, they're shouting out at us, you know, we've got to do something now. And he touches on you know, the need for that in the book.
Yeah, and he saw Tribune as an instrument of socialist education. That is faked in Tribune there.
Yeah.
And going back to what we talked about earlier with the criticisms of the trade unions and the labour movement, is one of the criticisms is Bevan didn't think they were educating people in socialism, that the decisions were made at the top.
Yeah.
The constituency Labour parties and the trade union rank and file were not consulted on these issues properly, and therefore they weren't having that socialist agitation within the party. And for Bevan, coming from the background that he came from, that was central to his politics in Tredegar. Going to the Central Labour College in London, learning about Marxism, learning about the history of radicalism in Britain, going to Marxist educational classes in South Wales. You know, this was vital to Bevan, and he argued he didn't see the Labour Party as fulfilling that function over time, and I think. I think that education was important.
Yeah, and we're seeing that rebirth now within the union movement in terms of socialism, understanding what workers' interests are, how do you organise, how do you bargain, you know, where does the power lie and the rest of it. And I think that you can see that in terms of the different leadership, you know, amongst the unions over the last decade or so, and the issues and debates and discussions that people have been having, you know, and linking them back into, you know, the community is the workers are the community. And I think that Nye really genuinely understood that.
And in the party, we've lost it to a lot of sense. We had community organisers, didn't we? Went to Jeremy, and a lot of that is sadly gone. So, credit to the unions.
It would be remiss of me on this week of all weeks, where we're celebrating the 75th anniversary of the NHS, to not ask you what you all think Nye Bevan would think of the modern day NHS, and of course our modern society as we live in it now. But obviously, I could appreciate if you give very short answers on this question, because I know that I'm getting shouted at to wrap up.
Short answer, I don't think you'd like it. The NHS across the different NHSs across the UK. I think one of the things for me is coming back to the legacy of Bevan. There's a lot of talk about Bevan's values and principles, but quite often this can get reduced to free at the point of delivery. That's the value of the NHS that Bevan. That wasn't the only thing about the NHS. Bevan saw the NHS as one part of changing society. So when there's discussions about the NHS today and the state of the NHS, going back to Bevan's work, we can see that, or his broader political philosophy, we see it's about more than just illness treatment. Rhodri Morgan talked about how Bevan didn't create a national health service, he created a national illness treatment service, but it didn't sound as nice being called MITS. So for Bevan, it was about wider society, going back to the economy, giving people the opportunity to lead fulfilling, flourishing lives. So looking at the NHS today and trying to go back to Bevan's values and Bevan's principles, I think we need to go beyond the free at the point of delivery aspect, which is important, but look more widely and the different socio-economic factors that feed into good health, healthy lifestyles, etc. And I think that for Bevan was really important.
Beth?
I completely agree. Yesterday up in Parliament, we had Sir Michael Marmot come and give a presentation, and he spoke about the social determinants of health and inequality. You cannot divorce the health system from the wider socioeconomic factors and issues within society. And I shared the concerns about, you know, the comments about the need to prioritise, and this comes back, and I know I keep repeating myself, is about having our vision. You know, we have got the means in order to have a world-leading NHS, but also to tackle the poverty and inequality, and you can't do one without the other. And we have to look at the health system within the broader context. We have to look at it in terms of the preventative measures. It needs to be looked at in conjunction with the social care system, which is seriously in crisis at the moment. So it's about prevention as well as treatment. And unless we look at it in the round, we are facing a difficult future in terms of the National Health Service, and I really do have, concerns about, even within my own party, the reference to the need for a private system or a private element to the system. It must be retained within the public sector, and that's something that I will continue to fight for within the party as well as outside of it. But it's part of the transformational change that needs to happen, and credit to Bevan for establishing it, and credit to you for not back. It's really good. It's not generally.
Sure.
I think you would have said, what about social care, and why isn't that free at the point of need? And given the ageing population that we have here, it's absolutely fundamental that any kind of privatisation, outsourcing, get rid of it all, we bring it back in, it's got to stand right next to the NHS, it's interlinked wholeheartedly. And I think that he would have said, well, who's going to work in NHS or social care? I think he would be really deeply concerned about the fact that we've got a massive recruitment retention crisis, the fact that, workers are genuinely leaving. They're leaving not because of a choice, but because they're exhausted and they can see that there's other options for them. And so I think he would be really worried about worker interests, and I think he would be saying, we need to have pay justice today, not tomorrow.
Thanks to our host. Thanks to the host.
Again, thank you very much for coming. If you've enjoyed what you've heard this evening, please don't forget to find Hiraeth on all the socials, even the new ones that keep appearing out of nowhere, at Hiraeth Pod, and go to our website, www.walespolitics.com. Thank you very much. Thank you for listening to Hiraeth. If you like what you heard, please don't forget to subscribe, rate and review.